Despite winning the 1992 general election, things were already looking grim for the Conservative Party in the UK, despite most economic indicators showing the country finally beginning to emerge from the early 90s economic recession. In May, the party had lost a by-election in Newbury, converting a majority of just over 12,000 into a deficit of 22,000. A couple of weeks later, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, was forced to resign after an ill-judged press conference. In late June, Northern Ireland Minister Michael Mates had to resign after being implicated in a financial scandal involving Turkish Cypriot businessman Azil Nadir, who had fled to northern Cyprus to avoid prosecution. And now there was more trouble brewing over Europe, with a group of MPs known as the Maastricht Rebels voting against their own party on a series of votes to approve the Maastricht Treaty. Perhaps ironically, there was one very concrete indication of closer physical ties between the UK and Europe that week, as the first high-speed Eurostar train made the journey from France to the UK through the completed Channel Tunnel, preparatory to the projected public opening in 1994. The Eurostar trains were built in France and based on the French TGVs, but with some modifications, notably the addition of a pickup for the third rail DC power used in the south of England. And it was to test this that first train had been sent through the tunnel after its shakedown tests in France. There had been 2 more IndyCar races since Canada, in Detroit happening on the same day, and then at Portland 2 weeks later. Detroit itself was familiar ground for Mansell, but the street circuit, he remembered, had been replaced last year by a new track at Belle Isle, intended as a temporary one while some much-needed work was done on the crumbling streets. The new track was narrow and slow, with few passing opportunities, but it was at least smooth, and Mansell took pole with Fittipaldi alongside, then Paul Tracy and Stefan Johansson on row 2. After another tardy start, Mansell took the lead during the pit stops, with Johansson hot on his heels, while Fittipaldi properly buried himself in the tyre wall trying to pass Lyondike. After their own stops, Mansell and Johansson were still together, but now fighting over third, behind Bobby Rahal and Paul Tracy. Teo Fabi hit one wall and Eddie Cheever clouted his rear wing on another, and when Mansell slowed to avoid Cheever, Johansson went for the gap only to go straight into Fabi's abandoned Chaparral Chevrolet. Mansell, however, had also picked up a flat tyre from all the debris on the track and dropped back to 10th when he changed it. With Scott Tracy dropping out of contention too with a stop-go penalty for speeding in the pit lane, teammates Al Unser Jr. and Danny Sullivan, both former champions, were having a terrific scrap for the lead until little Al went over some cones trying to pass and was given a 10-second penalty. So Danny Sullivan came home to win, with Raul Boesel and Mario Andretti completing the podium, and Italian rookie Andrea Montemini taking 4th in just his second IndyCar race. Mansell, meanwhile, had crashed out in the final stages, so Boesel closed the gap at the top to just 3 points. And off to Oregon, where the stewards had responded to criticisms that Mansell had brought with him from F1 a more robust driving style, which had spread through the grid, with much more blocking and weaving than was traditional. Here, it was said, they would be clamping down on that sort of thing. Mansell was on pole again, and kept his lead this time, chased closely by Emerson Fittipaldi. It was Nigel who cracked first, going straight on and collecting a cone and a 10-second penalty. It rained, and Fittipaldi came straight in for wets, but Mansell stayed out in the lead on slicks, gambling that the rain wouldn't last. But it did, and in he came, dropping back to 3rd, then made a late switch back to slicks once the rain did stop and the track started drying. Penske called Tracy in from 2nd at that point and put new wets on, while Fittipaldi was still leading on wets too and a lap ahead of the whole field. Mansell, his slick tyres now much faster, came up behind Fittipaldi to unlap himself, which he managed when Mo finally pitted for slicks himself. A slick Penske stop meant that he was back out in good time, while Mansell was stymied by backmarkers, but a trademark late charge was rewarded with 2nd place, as Mo took his 3rd Portland win on the trot. With Boesel 7th, Mansell was able to extend his lead again, while Fittipaldi closed in on his fellow Brazilian. And so to France, where the 24 Heures du Mans had been run with a brand new formula following the implosion of the Sports Car World Championship and the smallest entry list in history in 1992. The Automobile Club de l'Ouest, who ran the Le Mans race, came up with its own regulations for a Le Mans prototype category, while the US-based IMSA had also announced a new similar World Sports Car category. So for 1993, Le Mans would be open to any car legal for the 1991-2 races, which meant the Peugeots and Toyotas in Category 1, IMSA Group C cars or pre-1991 Le Mans cars in Category 2, the new IMSA World Sports cars in Category 3, and GT cars in Category 4. Despite fears that many of the big manufacturers had moved on from sports cars, they did end up with a full entry list of 58 cars, including the works Peugeots and Tom's Toyotas, as well as 3 Jaguar XJ220 supercars entered by Tom Walkinshaw, the first Ferrari seen at Le Mans since 1984, a 348 LM GT car, and a curious composite sports car designed by boat builder and sometime race driver Fulvio Balabio and built in former Soviet Georgia. As might be expected, much of the race was a duel between the Peugeots and Toyotas, but all kinds of mechanical troubles plagued the Japanese cars, and it was left to Peugeot to claim a clean sweep of the podium, with Jeff Brabham, Eric Ellery and Christophe Bouchou, the latter two in their first Le Mans, leading home the much more experienced crews of Boutsen, Dalmas and Fabi, and Baldi, Alio and Jabouille. Eddie Irvine and his Japanese co-drivers Toshio Suzuki and Masanori Sekiya had to be content with 4th and a new lap record. The other categories were won by Roland Ratzenberger, Mauro Martini and Naoki Nagasaka in a Group C Toyota, Patrick Gonin, Bernard Santal and Alain Lamouille driving for former Peugeot design head Gerard Welter, and Jürgen Barth, Joël Gouillet and Dominique Dupuis in a Porsche 911 Carrera in Group D. Having overseen the triumph at Le Mans, Jean Todt left the team in the capable hands of Jean-Pierre Jabouille to take up his new post at Maranello, charming the sceptical Italian press by addressing them in their own language, which he'd learned over the last few months, paying tribute to Niki Lauda and confirming Alesi and Berger as drivers for 1994 and 95. The press had already nicknamed Todt Il Piccolo Napoleone. His former employers, meanwhile, had apparently changed their minds about not getting into F1, and the CEO of the sporting arm of the company, Jacques Calvet, had dispatched an engine designer, Jean-Pierre Boudy, to Magny-Cours to put out feelers about potential engine customers. Top of the list, of course, was thought to be McLaren, who were still very keen to get a top engine deal. Todt was not the only Frenchman on a charm offensive either, as Alain Prost sought to win hearts and minds. He'd always had supporters in France, of course, but his austere clinical style and a perception of him as a tricksy political operator had always meant that he'd never had the level of adoration enjoyed by Ayrton Senna or, more gallingly, Jean Alesi. Now hoping to win his 7th French Grand Prix, he headed off to a series of Renault dealerships, parts departments and so on, chatting amiably to the workers and generally trying to come across as an approachable regular guy. With the controversy over driver aids still ongoing, another FIA Extraordinary World Council was set to meet after Silverstone, it was back to fuel wrangles in France, as Ayrton Senna declared he had it on good but unspecified authority that the fuel used by Prost in Spain had been illegal. 2 different labs had tested said fuel and come up with different results, so a third one was contracted which had yet to report. But the talk was that both ELF, used by Williams, Ligier, Benetton, Sauber and Larousse, and AGIP, Ferrari, Minardi and Scuderia Italia, were in danger of being sanctioned. Interesting times indeed. Interesting times on the sponsorship front too, as it was coming time to get things in place for next year. Reynolds Tobacco had decided to cut back its expenditure as it went through a price war against Philip Morris, the Marlboro people, in the US. So on the Friday of race weekend, Camel announced that they were withdrawing from all sponsorship of F1 at the end of the year. Frank Williams promptly announced a new $20 million title sponsorship deal with South African tobacco band Rothmans, which in turn angered current title sponsors Canon, who were in the middle of negotiating an extension, and also announced that they were leaving F1 forthwith. Williams would be fine, but Benetton didn't seem to have anything in place yet themselves, judging by the thundercloud hanging over Flavio Briatore all weekend, which he was taking out on Riccardo Patrese after his rather undistinguished start to the season. Over at Ligier, the home team were optimistic for once. 2 podiums already so far this year, and the team always went well on home tarmac. Even the gripes about the roast-beef drivers had mysteriously gone quiet, though there were some calls for test driver Eric Bernard to be given the race seat at Magny-Cours. Former team owner Guy Ligier elected not to attend despite being invited down by Cyril de Rouvre, though his son Philippe flew the family flag. There was a last-minute panic at Woking, where Senna had noticed that he still hadn't actually had a signed copy of his contract back from Ron and threatened not to race until he got it. Dennis, who'd been hoping to keep postponing it in the hope of getting a 1994 extension on the promise of Peugeot engines, grudgingly complied, with Senna's agent Julian Jacobi literally phoning from a booth at Sao Paulo airport to make sure it had been done before the flight left. Ferrari had the new TT, telescopic trumpets, engine for the whole weekend with a new flap on the front wing to improve airflow, and there was yet another version of the troublesome active suspension for Berger. Jordan and Lotus both had new suspensions too, Tyrrell were promising that the new 021 chassis would absolutely definitely be ready for Silverstone, and Footwork had fitted their new McLaren active suspension and had borrowed Mika Hakkinen to shake it down alongside F3000 hot shoe Gilda Ferran. And so qualifying could begin. Prost had had a problem with his ABS system on Friday morning which had sent him flying off the track, so he turned it off. Friday's time saw Hill, who was still running the ABS, top of the timing sheets, with Schumacher third and Senna fourth, both well over a second adrift. On Saturday, times got faster, and there was a huge turnout to watch Prost take his 8th pole position on the trot, but they were to be disappointed because despite his best efforts, Prost couldn't quite beat his teammates' time, finishing Saturday just 0.142 seconds off, and Damon Hill had his first career pole position. But the heads were also turned by the other Renault-powered cars as Martin Brundle and Marc Blundell enjoyed the billiard table surface of the track which suited the Ligiers perfectly to colonise row 2. 3 British drivers, but 4 Renault engines in the top 4 places. Senna could do no better than 5th, 1.882 seconds off the top, with a lazy alongside, then Schumacher an unusually lowly 7th, alongside an excellent Rubens Barrichello, his best yet in the updated Jordan. Comas and Alliot took row 5 for the Larousse team as they continued to have a good year. The Saubers had struggled with both setup and traffic, and Wendlinger could only manage 11th, alongside Patrese, while Berger, pronouncing his car as undrivable and still suffering the tail end of a bout of flu, was down in 14th between the two footworks. Michael Andretti had also struggled in his case with understeer and was even further back, in 16th just behind Warwick. The updates to the Lotus hadn't worked, with Zanardi 17th and Herbert 19th after blowing 2 engines, while Boutsen was brought down to earth with a bump after his Le Mans heroics, down in 20th. The usual suspects made up the back rows, for the last time in the case of Fabrizio Barbazza, whose sponsorship from Beta Tools had been for 8 races and it hadn't been renewed despite his good results, so he would be replaced from Silverstone onwards by Pierluigi Martini. At the back, Michele Alboreto made it 4 DNQs in the last 5 races, which wouldn't improve the morale of a team who had been told here that, to nobody's great surprise, they would not be having Ferrari engines again in 1994. The sun blazed down as the F1 world paused to remember James Hunt, with Jonathan Palmer given the difficult task of following in his footsteps in the BBC commentary booth, and the assembled French dignitaries remembered Pierre Bérégovoy, the Mayor of Nevers, former Prime Minister and Finance Minister, who had been instrumental in bringing the race to Magny-Cours, and had shot himself at the start of May amid intense press coverage of both his colossal election defeat in March and his alleged involvement in a financial scandal. Some drivers, including both Benettons and Alesi, went for A compound tyres for their increased durability in the heat, and with Prost deciding to take the spare car out for race day, they were ready to go. A perfect start from Hill and no incidents further back meant a clean getaway, and Damon led away from Prost, then the 2 Ligiers and Senna, while a fired-up Barrichello was trying hard to get past Alesi, succeeding briefly only to lose the place again. As they completed the first lap, Hill had already opened up a gap to Prost of about 2 seconds, and Allaire was in turn about the same distance ahead of Brundle in third, with Blundell, Senna and Schumacher all right behind. Prost did seem to be having some handling problems, in fact, with his ABS still switched off. On lap 4, Zanardi pulled off with an active suspension failure, finally getting moving again, but the car, already difficult, was now undrivable, and he pulled in to retire a few laps later. Behind the Ligiers, Senna and Schumacher were fighting a spirited battle over 5th, and ahead of them, the Williamses were marching off into the distance. The 7,000 or so corporate guests of Renault were certainly being treated at this stage to a fine demonstration of French engineering superiority. Surely at some point, dutiful team player Hill would pull over to allow Prost through at his home race, or have some kind of tactful minor technical gremlin that would slow him sufficiently but preserve his honour. Off-camera, Barrichello had got past Alesi and made it stick this time, while Andretti was also moving up, passing Warwick, Berger and Alliot to get up to 14th. Katayama had dinged his oil pan bouncing over a curb and was overheating a bit, so he came in on lap 9 to have his radiator cleared of rubbish and set off again, emerging just in front of the Williamses. But unbeknown to the Japanese driver, his engine was still emitting a fine haze of oil, which was affecting Prost and Hill's visibility and was clearly shown on Prost's in-car camera as he repeatedly wiped his visor. And Hill had to slow up a bit, which allowed Prost to close right up as Katayama made lots of room for them, then expired anyway in a cloud of oil smoke. By now the 2 Williamses were a whopping 15 seconds ahead of Brundle after just 11 laps, While Alesi was being pursued closely by Comas, Wendlinger and Suzuki, Jean Todt had a lot of work to do. Further back, his other driver Berger was locked in a fierce scrap with Herbert and Warwick over 16th place. Comas had decided in the bright conditions to wear sunglasses for the race. Usually he wore contact lenses, but on this occasion he felt he wanted the extra filter, and it certainly didn't appear to have affected his performance so far. Senna and Schumacher were still running together with Marc Blundell. The Ligier just had too much Renault grunt under acceleration compared to the Ford V8s in the McLaren and Benetton, and Marc was just able to keep ahead of them. Barbaza's last race, at least for now, ended after 16 laps when his gearbox tipped him into a spin, and at around the same time Herbert lost downforce behind Berger and Warwick in the Estoril bend and trudged off to the pit. The Williamses were approaching the back of that Berger-Warwick battle, taking 19th place Boutsen and setting about Luca Badoer, doing well in 18th in the Lola before reaching Christian Fittipaldi, who'd taken over from Herbert at the back of the battle. Hill looked more confident than previously through traffic, but Prost was still right with him, taking a look as Hill came up to lap the Minardi. There was another hairy moment as Hill passed Warwick, but Berger had pitted for new boots, so once he was past, the track was clear. Unseen by the cameras, Blundell went to lap de Cesaris, but the Italian wasn't using his mirrors, cut him off and sent the Ligier into the tyre wall. Not a happy bunny, especially as he'd been quite happily keeping Senna behind him. On lap 22, Wendlinger pitted, missing third and fourth gears as Comas and Warwick were the first in for routine tyre stops. The Sauber got moving again after 30 seconds, just as Leto was abandoning ship with a complete gearbox failure of his own. Patrese and Brundle came in too, then Senna and Schumacher, and then on lap 27 Damon Hill peeled off, following Suzuki and Andretti in to make his stop. The McLaren pit mechanics did their usual slick job and got Andretti out in front of Hill, and then Wendlinger pulled out right in front and nearly collected Andretti. What is it with those two? All of which would only aid Prost, who had a clear track ahead of him and a 17-second lead when he came in for his own stop. A quick stop got Prost out in the lead, but only just, so the teammates renewed their scrap as they came to lap Alesi. Badoer, having stopped for tyres, felt something snap on his left front suspension and wobbled to a standstill, a shame because he'd been up to 12th. So, with the pit stops shaken out after 30 laps of the 72, Prost led Hill with Brundle third, over 30 seconds back, then Senna and Schumacher, those two in the Ligier all a couple of seconds apart, and then Barrichello another half minute behind the German but up in the points. Comas in 7th was the last man on the lead lap as Senna forced his way past Warwick, who was going all out to keep ahead of a revitalised Suzuki in the other footwork, the pair battling over 15th. Brundle was held up a bit by Alliot, allowing Senna to close up on the Ligier. Meanwhile, the other McLaren was still motoring, mostly unseen by the cameras, though the director did find time for a replay as Andretti took 8th place off Alesi. Hill was still hovering on Prost's gearbox as the Frenchman continued setting fastest lap, but the Briton seemed to be making no move to challenge his team leader, while Berger made a second tyre stop on lap 42, finding his new active suspension was once again wrecking both his car balance and his tyres. The leaders came back past the battling footworks, and Suzuki nearly took Prost off before blocking him for nearly a whole lap, as Schumacher made a second stop to see if a new set of boots would help him get past Senna, followed by Brundle, who despite a quick stop by his crew returned to the track behind a flying Schumacher, who set fastest lap on his first flying lap out of the pits. Not flying was Jean Alesi, who miserably trailed in on lap 47 to retire with yet another dud V12. On fresh tyres, Schumacher was quickly catching Senna as Patrese made his second stop, and a couple of laps later Andretti came in from 7th to switch to softer tyres so he could make a late charge, not losing his place and emerging just between Senna and Schumacher, who had closed right up when Senna was held up by de Cesaris. A lap or so later the Benetton got past Andretti, and now it was once again a straight battle between the Series 6 Ford in the McLaren and the Series 7 in the chasing Benetton, the last time that Senna would have to use the older engine, as McLaren were due to move up to the newer one from Silverstone onwards. On lap 62 Patrese was right behind Fittipaldi and angling after his 8th place, only for the Minardi to slow more quickly than expected, perhaps missing a gear, bouncing Patrese into the air and shedding his front wing, coming back in for a new one. The team outdid themselves to get it on in 12 seconds, they were getting plenty of practice with Ricciardo at the moment. And as the race entered its final laps, the Williamses were still running in formation, with Senna and Schumacher likewise close together in 3rd and 4th, but some 40 seconds off the leaders, then Brundle some 6 seconds behind those two. Martin was the last man on the lead lap, followed by Barrichello, with Andretti still sticking with Senna and hoping to bushwhack Comas as he moved over Senna and Schumacher to lap him. Somehow missed by the cameras, Schumacher got past Senna into third at the hairpin on lap 65, only to nearly go into the back of Comas in his eagerness to put a car between himself and Senna. Ayrton was struggling for grip on his old tyres, and not only was Andretti keen to get past and have a go at Comas himself, but Brundle was catching up too. The Larousse was suffering transmission problems though, and both McLarens breezed past before Eric miserably toured in to retire on lap 67, and Andretti set off in pursuit of Rubens Barrichello, who, like his mentor Senna, was clinging on heavily worn tyres. That point for 6th place, though, would not only be Barrichello's first, but the first of the year for the Jordan team, and was worth a good few million in financial support for the second half of the season. Senna lapped Warwick again, and the access panel for the footwork's active suspension flew off in the slipstream, thankfully doing no harm to anyone and easily retrieved by the marshals on the pit straight. Senna, with Andretti still in tow, now came up behind a struggling Barrichello as Prost began his last lap. While the French director watched Prost tour around triumphantly, Barrichello moved over to let Senna through and left the door open just a little too long, and Andretti muscled through, as Prost crossed the line to win his 6th French Grand Prix with Hill right on his tail. Pit stops aside, the pair had never been more than a couple of seconds apart for pretty much the entire race, taking the first 1-2 finish for Williams of the year. Schumacher came home a very happy third, having bested Senna on track, while Brundle had to make do with 2 points for 5th place, and Andretti picked up the last point at the last second after his most impressive drive in F1 so far. Barrichello was a dejected 7th, followed home by Fittipaldi, with 15 classified finishes. And so Alain Prost took to the podium for the 100th time, the first driver ever to break that particular milestone, and his 49th win. He received his trophy from Jean-Marie Balestre, honour restored after missing out on pole, and enjoying the adulation for a change of the 70,000 packed into the remote circuit. No champagne on the podium, thanks to that same French law that outlawed tobacco advertising, so the three headed straight off to the interview room. Prost had extended his title lead over Senna, with Hill's 4th runner-up spot of the year drawing him a bit closer to the Brazilian too. Prost could win his 50th Grand Prix in just a week's time at Silverstone, but many hoped Hill, the dutiful number 2, would be rewarded there for all his hard work with home glory.